Okay, everybody. Good morning. My name is Nathan Eason with the University of Georgia Extension in Northeast Georgia, a little county called White County. I serve also on the American Society of Enology and Viticulture Eastern Section Board for a second term. So glad to be a part of that organization, and that is kind of why we're all here. This Hangtime, Grapevines to Wines, used to be called a lunch hour. It's just gone to an hour, or just Hangtime for short. It's just an opportunity for us, industry, academic and private industry, to have relevant discussions that affect the entire country. And that's the beautiful thing about ASEV Eastern Section, is that we can have conversations that relate to every producer, and we can share. We have professionals that share their experience, their knowledge, their research with you. And there's also a lot of these land grant universities are doing great work on their own, and we encourage you to check out some of those resources too. But this is our little piece of the pie, and appreciate you joining us this morning. Our discussion today is going to be grapes of the South. Last month we did grapes of the North and talked about cold tolerant varieties that are be planted up north, and so we kind of had that a little more clearly defined in what a cold tolerant grape looks like, and because that can be relevant to where you are geographically in your own state. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go over a few housekeeping things. If you have questions during this session, please raise your hand. There's a little symbol down at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse over it, it'll say raise hand. And if you have a question that you want to ask audibly, we will unmute you and you can ask your question. And that is the purpose of this presentation and all Hangtime sessions. It's a conversation. Let's have a conversation. We'll have a conversation amongst the panelists, but we encourage you to be a part of that and ask questions and comment. If you don't like how you sound on the recorder, then you can chat or chat. Not, you can chat. I'd prefer you go to the Q&A box to submit your questions, and I will keep track of that, and our panelists can answer those questions. And you should be able to type in the chat box if need be. So to start off with, what we do is ask that during this time, if everybody will go into their chat box, not the Q&A, but the chat, and enter the state in which you originate in, and or are currently. And that way, that'll help us reflect who our audience is. So panelists, please pull up your chat bar and note the states that are coming up. Thank you for joining us. At this time, I'm going to let our panelists get introduced, and I'm going to let them do their own self-introduction so I don't butcher it. So I will start with Dr. Justin Shiner.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Shiner, and I am in College Station, Texas, and I work in the area of viticulture. So primarily, I work through Extension, so I get to work with all the good people in the grape and wine industry in Texas.
All right. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Justin. Sarah Louder.
Hi, everyone. I am Sarah Louder. I am the Extension Viticulturist for the University of Georgia, so statewide in Georgia, and as an assistant professor in the horticulture department.
Thank you, Ms. Sarah. Mr. Mark Hoffman.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Mark Hoffman. I am the viticulturist here in North Carolina, and I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina.
And past president of ASEV.
And past president of ASEV. Glorious times.
That's all right. Thank you. Mr. Patrick Connor.
Patrick Connor, I'm at the University of Georgia in the horticulture department. I'm located on the Tifton campus, which is in the south part of the state of Georgia. And I'm the muscadine breeder for the University of Georgia.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Patrick. And Mr. Eric Staffney.
Hi, I'm Eric Staffney from Mississippi State University. I'm located in Poplarville, Mississippi, which is in the southern part near the Gulf Coast. We are working with muscadine and bunch grape varieties down here.
Thank you for joining us with this, Eric. So that is your panels for today. We are hoping to have Renee Threlfall, who comes from Arkansas State University, and possibly consultant Fritz Westover, hopefully to join later on. If they do, great. If they don't, we're going to rock and roll on with our kind of outline. So I'll get this show on the road. So kind of I'm going to mirror exactly what we did with the cold tolerant grapes. And that is, we need to first of all define, kind of go from a 30,000 foot approach and broad paint strokes and think what defines a Southern grape. Now we've got some people on from New York on here, and I go, whoa, but they're also East Coast, and New York gets hot and they have rain and they have humidity as well. So we have, it's just like our last session, we have people from across the country, but I'm a Yankee in North Georgia, but to the Southerner and South Georgia. So panelists, y'all help me answer this question. What makes in your line of work, what makes a Southern grape? When you're evaluating them, when you're studying them, what are some of the things that jump out at you? And you take the lead.
Well, I mean, in Southern Georgia, I mean, the first thing you always have to look at is Pierce's disease resistance. Because if they don't have resistance to that, we just are not able to grow them once you get into the Piedmont and coastal plain of Georgia. And so that to me would be the number one thing I think about when I think about Southern grape.
Now, and I would be interested from anybody listening in, these from New York, if y'all are seeing any Pierce's disease at all, or what is that? Maybe Sarah, you can help me out. That might start in kind of Virginia and down. But Pierce's disease for a lot of the folks across the South, all the way to Texas, definitely a consideration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hopefully it isn't quite up in the New York. You'll have at least cold enough winters. You should help cure that. But we are hearing, I've heard some reports in Virginia and even some coastal Maryland from stuff that could potentially be some Pierce's disease, at least hopefully just spot treatments. But yeah, for at least for our Southern grapes, I think that's certainly a very big question, because there are a whole lot of grapes, which I think you can't start talking about Southern grapes without referring to muscadines. So for anyone that might be on the call that is not familiar with a muscadine, it is a native species to the Southeast. And if you haven't tried one, you should, because they're delicious. But as for bunch grapes, there are a lot of different things, and a lot of different things that a lot of people are trying, because a lot of the grape growers in the Southeast are still it's still a fairly young industry. And so there's still a lot of exploration that goes through. But a lot of what defines a Southern grape, I think, is the limitations that you deal with. Like, will it grow in the South is one of the big questions that we all look at, I think, going through.
Anybody else want to comment? Go ahead. Oh, Mark, you were Mark. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I agree. I would add though that for some regions, at least in North Carolina, if you move further into the western part of North Carolina, Pierce's disease becomes a less big of a problem. We do have areas where we do have Pierce's disease, and especially in areas like the Yadkin Valley or even in the foothills, Pierce's disease is a factor, and it has become a bigger factor in the past. The pressure is not as high that we would have to necessarily go into Pierce's disease cultivars, but there's a lot of management that has to be done, especially in small vineyards. They have to stay on top of their Pierce's disease management. It can spread pretty fast if they do not manage even here. We're kind of lucky that we don't have the classic wing sharpshooters everywhere. I don't know how that is in Texas, but maybe Justin can talk a little bit about that. But we're lucky we have vectors, but they're not as efficient as the classic wing sharpshooter is. We do have the classic wing sharpshooter in the eastern part, in the southeastern part of North Carolina more, and at the coast. So that's where it gets very difficult to grow anything that has not Pierce's disease resistance. Not that people are not doing it, they're doing it, but it's extremely management intensive and associated with a lot of cost. I would also add, for us here in North Carolina, frost is a big issue every year. I'm pretty sure it's the same in Georgia. And so anything which is early bud breaking is difficult, or anything which is early bud break and only has primary fruitful shoots is difficult, I would say. And then we get a lot of rots into our grapes. So everything which is like tight clusters and thin-skinned is a management problem in the southeast. So that probably is across the entire East Coast, but it's a lot worse in the southeast than it would be basically in the upper, the Finger Lakes or somewhere there. So we do have a lot of disease pressure, especially in summer on stuff like this pretty tight clustered. So our industry is relatively young, but we're moving a lot more into hybrids that seem to work a little bit better here, French American hybrids.
Mark, what's that elevation on those areas where you're seeing significantly less PD?
As soon as we go up into the Appalachian Mountains, so foothills is still like elevation somewhere between, I guess, like 1,000 to 1,500 or something, and we do see Pierce's disease there.
All the way up to 1,500 feet.
Yeah, we have a vineyard that yes, it's relatively new. It's an area where we didn't have Pierce's disease before, but we had, we saw some Pierce's disease there in the last couple of years. I don't know if it's there to stay or if it's going to go away with the next cold winter that we have. It really depends a lot how cold those winters are.
Yeah.
But if we go up to the mountains, we do have Pierce's disease incidences there, but they're not they usually don't stay. So that's how it looks in North Carolina at the moment. And we do not know what the vectors are that are moving in. The last study on the vectors is relatively old here. So yeah. Justin, how does it look in Texas?
Everything's great in Texas.
Yeah,
I'm looking at Demi's comment here. Honestly, I normally zone out when speakers talk about PD, so I'll keep that part brief since we've been talking about it. But I will say, Texas is, it sounds like what you're describing North Carolina, it's not terribly different. Texas is large. If I were to drive to El Paso, that's 10, 11 hours, and I'm more in this little central part of the state. So rainfall 60 inches in the east, less than 12 in the west. So Pierce's disease in the east, not so much in the west. And when you talk about Pierce's disease and how, what's the risk? Just to give you an observation from this year, we planted 40 new grapevines in our vineyard that we knew were susceptible to Pierce's disease in College Station. Went back and tested at the end of the season. 38 of them were positive after one season for a Xylella. So pressure decreases as you move west, and it's just a risk probability game. So most of the state is vinifera by production standards. And so when you're talking southern grape, I would ask the question, where are you at? What's the rainfall? What's the humidity? Because even if the grape doesn't die from Pierce's disease, then you still have fungal diseases to worry about. Tighter the cluster, the greater the problem. And then you can narrow it down from there, of course, based on site. You could then eventually land on quality. And in my part of Texas, it's 100 degrees in the summer. It's 100 degrees in the western part of the state, but it doesn't cool off here. We had a record this year. I don't recall how many days, 20, 30 nights in a row that did not fall below 80 degrees Fahrenheit at night. So in terms of suitability, it needs to be a grape that ripens under those conditions. We can work with acidity to some degree, but things like phenolics, that's not something we can necessarily work with. So some of the work we do as far as variety trialing, it's not only will it not die and we can grow fruit, but what is the quality potential of the fruit?
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just add on to that as well that, in Mississippi, it's all about Pierce's disease here, because where I'm at, we're in the far south part of the state, and things, you just don't survive here very long, if they're susceptible. So, but, one of the things about Pierce's disease too is that I'm not sure that, we talk about it as it's tolerant or resistant or susceptible. And I don't think that's not really how things are in the real world. There's a continuum of these things, depending on your variety and your location and all these sort of things. So something that does not have Pierce's disease in one location may show up with Pierce's disease in another location. And I think that is, something that growers need to keep in mind as well, is that we can say that it's resistant or tolerant, but until you've grown it in your location, you just don't know for sure. And I think that that's one of the things about Pierce's disease, that maybe we don't have a complete understanding of everything, all the parameters that go into that.
Thank y'all for sharing. So those are some great points. And, we talk about heat. We talk about tolerance of cold. We may can have some more of that discussion when we talk about weather. Something that, we do have the cold blast, just like the rest of the country has when those polar vortexes shove south and get us, cause potential splitting on the trunks and whatnot. But, and sometimes I think of a southern grape, I think of something that might be vigorous, that a plant is meant for more arid conditions, but here we are, we're having to hedge. I remember we went up to Virginia for a conference and we were sharing with folks how many times we hedge our VSP systems, and hedging 5-6 times a season, and people thought that's ridiculous. Well, we have to control that vigor. Sometimes our warm, moist environments create that issue. Well, just kind of keeping the conversation moving, with that, we have limitations. So, I can generally say, let's discuss breakdown weather, soils, and pests and diseases. So we can kind of keep it relevant to the country. We've mentioned Pierce's disease, but I guarantee everybody in this room could talk about downy mildew. So we can get to that discussion in just a minute. But sometimes we get made fun of here in the South that we're even attempting to grow grapes. That we it's the whole idea that we can't grow quality grapes. But at the end of the day, every state in the country is trying to make a name for themselves in this industry, and they are working hard to see what is suitable for them. And I will talk about breeding programs here in a little bit, but to me, that's the exciting part, is the breeding programs, because you're developing something new. But just to kind of have that discussion, limitations to growing grapes in the South. And let's try to dive a little bit deeper, assuming that our attendees today have a basic understanding of the introductory stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of has to do with your question, but can I circle back to what Justin said about the fruit quality?
Sure.
Yeah, because I think that's important for growers to understand, or for anyone who wants to start a vineyard in the South. I think that's a very consistent problem across the entire southern region, that some cultivars, you can't expect a similar quality than you would expect in a more arid kind of climate where you have different diurnal temperatures, especially with some of the Bordeaux. And that's at least what we see here, that they're not getting to that kind of quality that you would expect from a California, Merlot, for example, so I'm not sure if that's the same in Texas, but I would be very interested to hear from Justin what their experiences are about fruit quality, especially on those more critical cultivars where you either don't get the color or you don't get to the Brix level that you want to have, and yada yada. I think that's a really important point to understand on those cultivars, and at the same point also there are other cultivars that you have to almost every time to harvest, because otherwise they're going to rot on your vine, like things like Riesling or Grüner or even Chardonnay sometimes, So I think we could explore that a little bit before we move on. At least I feel we should do that.
Yeah, I can make some comments on that.
Yeah,
I mean, it's very year dependent, but I would agree with what you're saying as far as we do have in the western areas of the state higher elevation, drier air, and so you have a greater diurnal temperature fluctuation, which is good. We want that, of course. And then the other part is just being able to hold the fruit, because if you're in a more humid area, it just becomes increasingly difficult. And then from a more practical, if we're talking a production standpoint, you're now looking at pre-harvest intervals for things like fungicides. And you're looking at the forecast, and many times you have to harvest before you would ideally want to. Furthermore, with rain, often we see things like, we're tracking basic, composition in terms of making some of those harvest decisions, tracking, and then generally you're trying to look at other parameters, but soluble solids will often plateau in a lower sugar concentration than you might expect elsewhere, say, and compare it to vinifera, and we see challenges with some of the hybrids as well. If you're unfamiliar with the variety or the conditions, you may communicate to the grower to hold the grapes longer, and then some of the other parameters become undesirable, especially acids. So yes, I would say in general, of course, you're going to have differences based on the conditions that year. But if it's consistently wet or humid in that area, that region, then yeah, I would say in general, the fruit quality is probably going to be lower, but it would be variety dependent. And that's a lot of what we try to do with trialing as well. And I'll say one last thing. In Texas, you know, heat is not at all an issue. Cold has not been that much of a limiter in terms of what we grow. Therefore, producers are exploring many different varieties. We have commercial vineyards with over 30 different varieties. We know of at least, we know of more than 70 different varieties of grapes that are being grown commercially here. So as we learn more about their potential, we'll start to sort of kick them out, you know, in terms of this one's not suitable, this one's more suitable, et cetera. I mean, we have a long ways to go. We have a lot to learn for sure.
And I just want to make a comment to that. A lot of the land-grant universities, for folks who are attending that are in private industry, they're trying to develop those baselines. Penn State's doing it, Oregon's doing it, a lot of the upper Midwest. And Justin, are y'all doing that? Are y'all trying to gather a lot of information from producers of gate chemistries at harvest?
Yes.
Anybody else, Eric, anybody else that's doing that, trying to get that data, establish those baselines. We've sent out some surveys, but sometimes have very limited response. And everybody's busy, I get it, but how important are those baselines and understanding?
I would say very important. Honestly, I think one of the most important functions of extension is to be able to collect information. You know, we do research in-house, but we can learn more each year by working directly with the producers to learn what they're learning or learning with them and collecting that information and sharing it back.
Well, you know, in Mississippi, we hardly have any producers. You know, we have almost no one growing bunch grapes of any size. We do have some muscadine growers, but you know, we don't have wineries essentially. So, you know, this talk is generally in that direction. But most of the fruit from Mississippi is for fresh consumption, especially muscadines. And very little of it usually goes to juice, although some does, and almost nothing to wine, or very little. So we don't collect that because that information really doesn't exist for us. So we're having to do some of that, you know, on our experiment stations, kind of just start there and figure out, okay, this is what we can recommend or what we can't recommend. And hopefully that as the industry grows, then we can create those types of connections that will allow us to improve our information baseline.
I want to pause for a second, introduce two more folks that joined us as panelists. That is Renee Threlfall. Renee, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, I'm a research scientist at the University of Arkansas System. I do grape and wine research. I have a research extension and teaching appointment. Sorry, I was late. I was teaching my last class of 170 people today for the end of the semester. I'm also the administrator for ASEV-ES section.
Awesome. And Mr. Fritz Westover, if you'll introduce yourself, please.
Hey everyone, Fritz Westover. I'm a vineyard consultant and educator for vineyard owners. I'm based out of Houston, Texas. I consult in Texas, in Georgia, in Arizona, and through my online virtual viticulture academy, I also advise in about 30 states and 10 countries across the world. It's been fun.
Thanks for joining us. We're discussing just kind of these limitations of things, and we kind of already somewhat defined when we think of a Southern grape, what does that look like? Obviously, it's going to survive. It might be tolerant to high heat, be tolerant to vigor, or have vigor as assumption. But also, we could just produce a quality of wine. We know that's interpretive. We talked about Pierce's disease a little bit. And now Mark just wanted to make a point of every growing region has the ability to do things a little bit differently. And that's what's unique. That's why we have these areas identified. So those parameters can change. And what that kind of led to was gathering data and how important it is for industry to help us private these vineyards, these wineries, to provide universities with information on their harvest data so that we can begin to take those numbers, because it's a lot more data than we can do on our own, which is, and to Eric's point, every state's different, and they're still very young. Georgia's young, we all are young, but everybody's at different levels. But at the end of the day, I can definitely see every state in the country wanting some kind of a vineyard scene, and we've got to get to what that looks like. What about soils? I don't want to just talk about climate all the time, but soils can vary. Fritz, you're across the whole South a little bit, so I mean, I'm open to talk about. People call me, and here in Georgia, we have very acidic, heavy clay soils in North Georgia region where you typically grow a vinifera or a hybrid grape. Muscadines are going to be, I have 20 acres of muscadines in my county, but that's very rare in North Georgia. Most of our production's in South Georgia on sandy soils. But overall, we have a high acidity. So we're having to, whenever we have site selection, we're having to advise 4 and 5 and 6 tons of lime for initial soil amending. So I would love to hear what y'all are seeing, what people are doing as considerations.
Yeah, since you mentioned my name, Nathan, I'm just going to start by throwing the topic out there on rootstocks, because the first tool that we have to mitigate some of the issues with soil pH, for example, or nutrient uptake, or drainage, or water holding capacity, or wet feed, if you will, is the rootstock selection. And when we talk about unique varieties like French American hybrids, or even the Minnesota varieties, or even Concord, you look back at what Terry Bates showed many years ago with Concord grapes. If you put it on 3309 rootstock, the production went up. There were advantages to production and to quality, but getting the growers to spend another $1 per vine to put it onto that rootstock and then protect the graft the first year or two was a huge barrier. So even though he had the data, it never seemed to take off. And I think that's kind of one of my questions that I have for the group here too, is we have a lot of these French American hybrids, which we can put on their own roots, or we can put them on a rootstock. And one of the questions I always have, or one of the challenges I'm faced with as an advisor, is, are we better off going on own root? Well, if ultimate winter temperature is going to kill your vines down to the ground because you're getting to -20 or 30, then yeah, own root is probably what you want to do. But in these marginal areas where we don't get those hard freezes, or we do only occasionally, or we can rationalize hilling up, are we better off on a rootstock for solving those issues with soil? And I know that some of the French American hybrids like Vidal, they found that putting it on a rootstock maybe made it better off in the long run for phylloxera resistance, things like that. So we're finding these things over time. There's anecdotal information out there. I'm curious, maybe I'm not really answering a question, but I'm kind of expanding on your question. What do we know about rootstocks for solving problems with soil, as opposed to dumping a bunch of lime on and things like that, in terms of long-term sustainability and production? And what's going on in the universities to explore those possibilities?
Can I add something? Because I agree with you. Can I add something to this too? I think one way to use a rootstock here is also to control vigor, because we have like so much rainfall, and vigor control is a big thing. And a rootstock would be one tool to use in a spot where you do have a lot of rainfall, to control that vigor at least a little bit. So that's how I see rootstocks, at least in the South, being a big tool.
If I can say something here about the rootstocks, I think that's a really good point, Fritz, is that, for some of these varieties that can be grown in the South, the rootstocks make a huge difference. I think if we're looking at Pierce's disease tolerant varieties, we know almost nothing about rootstock variety combinations. We don't have any specific rootstocks, more or less, that do well in some of these areas, or we don't know how they do on with combination of certain varieties. And is there a development of any new rootstocks to improve that situation? The answer, to my knowledge, is no. we have some really big knowledge gaps in rootstocks in the deep south. Anyway.
I want to add here because I think we can't talk about soil and climate without talking about breeding, which I'll make Patrick Connor talk. But the breeding of new cultivars, particularly with, I think we all received the notice that the USDA changed. We changed some status levels here in Arkansas. So now we're starting to talk about Pierce's disease more in Arkansas, right? We're going to have to, particularly in the southern part of the state. But talk about breeding cultivars, that are well equipped to handle the climates and the soils of the South. I don't know, Connor, I don't know, Patrick, if you want to expand.
Well, we don't, and we pretty much are strictly a muscadine thing, and muscadine are luckily well adapted to very hostile conditions for most other fruit crops. So we haven't had a big challenge with them. One of the things I like about muscadine is they are really good at breaking bud late in the season, so we don't get most of the spring frost issues, and very tolerant to the summer rainfalls, especially if you grow the darker colored ones. So I would agree that to me it's unfortunate that we've seemed to have lost some of the breeding that was taking place in the South. I think Florida's program was a loss. That's been several years now that when Mortensen retired, but that one, and I'm glad to see Arkansas is still doing some breeding. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. We just need to get another good bunch grape breeding program maybe in the lower South.
Now I'm gonna play devil's advocate because I'm the host and I get to do this. But if I'm sitting here and I'm a participant and I'm on vineyard and winery and I'm going, well, what the heck are my tax dollars going to? What are y'all doing? If these are the biggest things that we don't know about, and why are we not starting? And your first elevator response would be, I'll turn it over to y'all.
Let's get Justin out here. He's actually doing rootstock work with Pierce's disease tolerant hybrids. So I'm gonna toss the baton over to Justin.
Thank you very much, Fritz. I would say, Mr. Taxpayer, we have done well. So if you wanted to say going all the way back, when did A&M start trying to figure out what grapes we could grow here? The first records I saw were in the 1890s of planting new varieties to see what would produce, and we're still doing it now. And one area that we do recognize that's incredibly important is rootstocks. And there are always questions about which rootstock is going to perform best. And what we find with trials and observations is that it's not 100% predictable for any given site. But what we'll do is we'll try to find sites that represent some soil type, some limitation, and we'll plan a rootstock trial. And so in the recent past, we had 3 of them, and they had 10 rootstocks in there. It was all replicated. Each trial was about an acre, which is fairly large for a variety trial. One site was in the Texas Hill Country in calcareous soil. pH was 8.5. Rocky soil, very droughty soil. And so those were the limitations there. And they all had a common scion. It was Sangiovese. Same rootstocks were planted in another site in the Hill Country. The pH was 8.6, sandy loam, beautiful soil. And then we had the same rootstocks planted once again in the Texas Gulf Coast, where Pierce's disease limits us to primarily Blanc de Bois and Black Spanish or Lenoir. And so the common scion there was Blanc de Bois. And so what we found are on those sites that were limiting, even the one in the Gulf Coast, the pH is 8.2, it's clay. Certain rootstocks really stood out, and it was vigor to some degree. It was nutrient uptake and nutrient status. That's important, of course, but also fruit quality. And then what we found is that site that had really nice soil, and soil itself, at least apparently, wasn't a limiting factor. All of the rootstocks we looked at performed acceptably well. Going to the most limiting site there in south of Fredericksburg, that calcareous soil with the fractured limestone, there were only a few rootstocks that could actually produce a canopy that was large enough to produce a crop. So rootstock would have dictated whether or not you could even be successful there. And I'll introduce this one's still somewhat of a head scratcher, and all it's going to do is introduce more questions. But colleagues at Texas A&M planted rootstocks as own-rooted vines in a vineyard, and they looked for symptoms of Pierce's disease. These were just unrooted, ungrafted rootstocks. And they also looked at bacterial loads, so titer levels over time. And certain rootstocks, depending on their parentage, because they're made up of different species in their background, would show more symptoms, carry a greater titer load, some would die outright. So there is an influence potentially there from the rootstock. And Luis Diaz Garcia, breeder at UC Davis, who is breeding rootstocks, I do believe there have been some selections developed there for potentially adaptability or greater tolerance, resistance, depending upon how you're defining it, to Pierce's disease. So
who's doing that breeding work on rootstocks?
Luis Diaz Garcia.
That's the name of a business, or that's a
No. He's the breeder at University of California, Davis.
University of Davis. Okay, UC Davis. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I would go all the way back around to try to answer this. The question is, rootstocks are important, of course. When you're doing your typical site evaluation, you're trying to figure out what is most limiting there and determine if a rootstock will help. And if it's cold and you plan on your vines are going to freeze down every so often, then you may not use a rootstock. But it's interesting because when it comes to these interspecific hybrids, the French Americans or otherwise, some of them do well, and say like a Linois Black Spanish on a fairly wide range of soils on their own roots, whereas say a Blanc de Bois, especially when you start getting above a pH of 7, rootstock becomes increasingly important. So it's definitely not a simple answer. And that's work that we need to continue to do. It's long-term research for sure.
And I'm going to summarize that. Yeah, I'm going to summarize that up and also say it goes to Eric's point, is every state is at different stages, and only until you have the industry develop and you can, through extension, we can prove that there is a need for a specialist in this department. Things don't get moving on the research side. And so Georgia hadn't had a viticulturist but for 6 years, or less, maybe 5. But so research takes time, takes funding, whether you have a local checkoff dollar with that industry to support that research. And I encourage every state to push that. And that's how you do that.
I'm going to comment, Nathan.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So with the new cultivars that are being developed, especially the new ones from UC Davis, there's still continuous need for things like rootstock evaluation, because we don't know how they're going to perform on their own roots. And to me, the ideal scenario for this is working directly with a cooperator, so a producer that's willing to host a research trial like that, because often that's a limitation for us. So when we can have a relationship like that with a producer, maybe they're looking at a new site to evaluate, maybe they're just looking to improve their practices. But when we can, cooperate and have trials like that, I think that's a win-win.
Absolutely. I got Bob here wants to ask a question. Bob, I'm going to allow you to talk. So I got you unmuted. If you'll just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Appreciate it. Hey, so obviously we've all been talking about rootstocks, and after reading something in the last week or so on 101.14 specifically, and its tendency to root very shallow, and then its relationship to vineyards and sites that are susceptible to cold damage in the spring. Obviously with soil temperatures being a little warmer at the higher in depth you get. Is there any research out there, or does anybody have anything to glean on that as it pertains strictly to cold damage in certain cultivars, like say Chardonnay, something early bud breaking?
And what's your location, Bob?
So we are out here in Western North Carolina, Polk County.
I'll open the floor.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Awesome so far.
Anybody want to take that?
Looks like he wants to say something.
Who, me? No, what I'm thinking of things right now, Bob, but what I'm thinking about is, when you're looking at acidic soil and you're trying to do a lower vigor scenario, and it's with vinifera, and you want earlier ripening so you get more time for recovery after harvest to harden off for winter, and you're bringing up a whole new aspect, which is shallower roots. I think of the two main rootstocks that we see in your scenario, which is 101.14 and Riparia Gloire, which are going to give that Riparia rupestris blend that's going to give you the lower vigor, earlier ripening. And so, you know, my thing is, I'm thinking of, we don't really have a lot of options, right? You have maybe 1616C if you want a little more vigor. You have maybe 3309 if you want a little bit more vigor. But is the advantage you're getting to the deeper rooting going to outweigh the possible disadvantage of longer time to ripening, which gives you less recovery time before the first hard freeze, which sometimes can come early? And what we're learning is the weather is changing a lot and we get these earlier freezes. It's happened in Texas, it's happened in other areas. The additional vigor you're going to have and the canopy management you might need to deal with, and the maybe just less ripe fruit. Maybe you're getting more production, but quality is different. So I think my point when Justin said, hey, I think Fritz has something to say, I'm just thinking in my mind, you could probably fix that with a different rootstock, but what other set of variables are you introducing and that you're going to have to deal with? And what is your ultimate goal? Which is the lesser of the evils that you want to deal with?
And I'll also pitch in that I know when I first became an agent, we had a vineyard that we had, it was another hard freeze. It was, again, for Georgia, we got down to 2-0 and overall low temperatures, and it was a late winter. So there's, I think, a little bit of sap flow already starting to push. And it was clear as day in the block of Chardonnay. You had some on 3309 and some on 10114s. And everyone that was on a 3309 rootstock was split wide open at the trunk, and everything else on a 10114. So that is a one-time incident that I got to witness that, but it was very unique how it was the difference in the rootstocks that had some kind of effect on that on that grape. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah.
Yeah, unmute yourself. I think you muted yourself.
Well, I can, Corey.
Go. Yeah, so there we go. First of all, thank you, Fritz, because the question was, literally rooted in the idea of I'm coming to decision-making time with vineyard planting over the next couple of years. And I totally agree. It was a matter of measuring the pros and cons. We're happy with quality. We're happy with ripening times. Most generally, frost isn't always an issue. It's most particularly in a couple spots here and here on our site. But no, thank you. That was perfect. It just really was trying to aid me in making a decision going forward. So that's perfect. Thank you.
Glad you're to be successful there, Bob. Get that answered. So we're gonna move on because an hour flies by in a heartbeat. A couple of things. Let's talk about varieties. When I think of, I kind of categorize as part of the talk as far as opportunity. So, I'll kick this off by saying, one thing is in Europe, they're defined by what grapes they can grow, how they can do their wine. It's very structured, very limiting in a sense of they have a quality to meet. And
Good point, though, right?
What's that? Yeah. Oh, I might need to mute him again. But here in the United States, it gives us a lot. We're brand new. Most states are, 30 years old. Some are older, they might have a longer history there, but we're new, and that allows for opportunities. So I'd love to hear from our panel, varieties that you're seeing that are being successful, and, blending opportunities that seem to have gained traction in your states. Vinifera, hybrid, others, muscadines. Patrick, feel free, and Eric, to talk about some of your favorite muscadines, because the only thing that's going to be next, and we'll have to keep this little limited conversation about 5 minutes or so, because I want to give every university on here and industry kind of one plug that they're doing that can update our audience here. So opportunities, cultivars, and winemaking. Go.
Our hybrid white Chambertin is pretty much our core red that grows well. We're talking about Arkansas grown. And for white, Vignol's harder to grow, but still a pretty good hybrid for our area. Otherwise, it'd be like Sabal or Vidal on the hybrid realms. Our vinifera got wiped out in that freeze in 2021.
In terms of the muscadine, there's really not a lot new on the juice market except for what they're doing in Arkansas. They have a new purple juice type that I would recommend people take a look at, because that's the first thing we've had in a long time in terms of juice and muscadine varieties. We don't, in our breeding program, handle juice because we don't have an enologist to work with.
Yeah, and so he's talking about AM-77, which is about to become a named cultivar.
So it's not ready for release, not ready for release quite yet, huh?
I can't say it out loud on a recorded Zoom about that, but if you email me, I might tell you.
So for any muscadine producers out there, Arkansas might have something new coming out.
Yeah, it's going to
Otherwise-
be a new black processing muscadine equivalent to what Noble can do for you.
Okay, so go back, Patrick. The tried and true muscadine cultivars are
Noble and
Carlos and Noble, pretty much everywhere. And there's, until now, there really hasn't been a compelling reason to try any of the juice ones. That's pretty much what everybody's growing. And so, like I said, it's new to have something different to maybe to trial anyway.
all right. Let's keep rolling on. Fritz, what are you seeing across Texas and Georgia and Arkansas?
I was hoping to go last. Let's let Justin go first.
All right.
Okay.
Or maybe Sarah.
You want to go, Sarah?
Sure. Yeah, we're seeing a whole lot of new stuff getting planted and a lot of new trials and stuff going in. But one of the ones that's a lot of bunch grape growers will plant that they're often happy with, although they certainly has a grain of salt, is the Norton vine. Is a red grape variety, which is a vigorous producer for sure. But that's one of the big ones that a lot of people will have in
hard
there.
to manage winemaking wise, I will say.
Yeah, you can certainly get some different opinions from the winemaker and from the viticulturist on site, for sure.
I got to plug Enchantment. It's actually, of the cultivars that the U of A released, has probably been the most successful wildly planted one that we've had. And it's only been, what, 5 years since it was released.
Some of the surveys and tastings y'all been doing, is that the one that's kind of risen to the top?
I think so. I think it's because it's hard to have, I mean, for all of our states in the South, a red that has color, is something we don't have a lot of. We have a lot of white hybrids and stuff like that, but not very many reds.
So do y'all have anybody grafting those yet? Any
No.
nurseries?
No,
Okay, so it's
they're all
enchantments.
unrooted.
So where would somebody get enchantment?
AA.
Double A vineyard. Okay. All right, Justin.
Okay. Yeah, I would say it's kind of the business model dependent. So there's 800 permitted wineries or permits in Texas, and most of them are direct to consumer. And if that's the case, the name is less important. The ones that are selling through wholesale, of course, cab and known names are going to rise to the top. But for those with direct to consumer, people are very interested in varieties like Tannat, some of the Italians, Aglianico, Montepulciano. You could go on there, but whites, Vermentino and Picpoul Blanc and Roussanne. You could say they have characteristics or profiles that are reminiscent of some of those very well-known varieties. And then in the eastern part of the state, where Pierce's disease is increasingly important, Blanc de Bois by acreage is the #1 white wine grape because it's PD tolerant. And there's been some really high quality wines produced from that. I don't anticipate that going anywhere. Linois Black Spanish, I know there's interest in potentially grafting over it, using it as a rootstock as we learn more about these new varieties from University of California, Davis, of what is going to perform well under those conditions. And then I'll let Fritz add his points on top of that if you have anything.
Yeah, because I work also in Texas where you are, Justin, I agree. Blanc de Bois and Linois, aka Black Spanish, are the tried and true PD tolerant wine grape varieties that have made it this far, and a lot of others have been tested alongside of them. Lamanto, you name it, Villard Blanc, and they've fallen below in the ranks for either wine quality or vineyard characteristics or yield or something that just wasn't desirable in the end. The Andy Walker stuff I'm talking about, PD right now, is out there. We have these 5 new varieties that are 90% or something percent vinifera. The problem is it takes 10 years to figure out which ones can make good wine. We know they make great wine in Napa. Okay, that's been proven, but we're not growing them in Napa. We're trying to, the biggest adopters of these varieties are probably going to be the southeastern United States, and we still don't know anyone who's making wine from them other than a few fringe vineyards that got them early on and have a barrel or two of wine. And Justin, I hear rumors you're already, throwing some out of your program because they can't get, ripe enough. And, we'll see. That's why we need you to do that work so we can see what gets ripe. But what I see is that we have all these new regions and fringe areas that have never been planted in grapes before. This is one of our biggest challenges, because if no one's done it before, you have no model to follow, you don't know what's failed, most importantly, much less what's going to succeed. So we're borrowing and taking things from one region to another. I find that I'm always looking from one region to solve a problem in another. And I just talked to Joe Juniper in Ohio this morning on my podcast. I interviewed him about his crazy spare parts viticulture, and he can grow vinifera at -10 Fahrenheit because he's covering the graft unions every year and hilling up, and he's using 4 trunks on his system in order to make vinifera work there. That's pretty extreme. And so what I'm wondering is, what can we borrow from the Cornell program that's going to help us in areas like Georgia? Is Aravel, which is a hybrid between Cayuga White and Riesling, but it doesn't rot like Riesling. What's that going to provide for a new niche to go alongside of the Red Norton that you mentioned? So I'm thinking, is Noire really doing well in these regions, and can we expect a Minnesota variety to do well in a place where we have a warm climate? So I asked Joe that in Ohio. I said, why aren't you growing some of these colder hardy varieties? He said, well, we have over 3,000 growing degree days. They'll be ripe too early. The pH will be out of balance. It's not going to make the type of wine here that would make in those regions where they grow them normally. So I think I don't know if I answered any questions, but we have our tried and true. I think we're going to end up borrowing from other regions that have similar challenges. But what we have to do when we do that is not just say it survives the cold there and we have cold here, so let's try it here. I think we also have to think, what are the requirements for ripening? What kind of differences do we have in disease pressure? And can we even expect it to ripen here the way it ripens where it came from? So anytime we're adopting these new varieties, that's kind of the big question. So I rely heavily on all of you here in this panel as an advisor to growers to do that research because it's a long process.
So we already mentioned that it's very important to have those relationships with growers and producers. What would y'all say, statistically speaking, is a fair number of vines to recommend a trial? If you're talking to a producer, now if you're doing research, you got an experimental plot design, and there's numbers based on that experimental plot design. But if we just said, hey, extension evaluation in the field, will you plant X number of vines? Are those vines in one row? Are they 2 or 3 rows that are 50 feet long? Do you like to plant in blocks or single rows? And what is that number? Can anybody comment to that?
The nursery
Fritz,
the nursery sells 25 vines per bundle. So my answer is 25 vines.
I mean, I just wanted to make sure that if somebody says, hey, look, I'll try something on my place, what is enough vines to make an assessment?
Yeah, I would agree with 25. I mean, part of it depends on the question you want to answer. If you're trying to make wine to any scale and you want to fill a barrel, then that becomes a factor in the equation. But if we're talking viticulture characteristics, we can learn quite a bit from 25 vines.
Yeah. The best case scenario would be if you could do this in a replicated trial on a farm, if the grower lets you do that. And 25 vine would be more than enough to do a replicated trial. Yeah.
I call it county agent research. I don't have to do all the stats and stuff that Renee and Justin and some of these other folks do. I just want to see what's it doing in the field. So and Fritz is nodding his head. I know that's what he does a lot too. Like, hey man, look, just to put in 25 vines and let's see what it does. And so it's just super important. And so I just hope that our audience, whomever sees this, is that try that 25 vines, put in, if you have the space to allow, because if you're not constantly learning and moving forward, you're going to struggle, I think, because we're so new. We've got to be constantly be willing to
so I think like one thing here in the South is, at least with the newer industries, and Texas is a little bit out of that because the industry there is so big and has grown so much. But we have 167 wineries right now in North Carolina, and we used to have less than 30, like 30 years ago. So we grew quite a bit in just a couple of years. And it used to be muscadines and vinifera's, and they kind of didn't talk to each other, you know. That has grown a lot together, and a lot of this is customer driven, you know. So we have a lot of wineries that do both now, and a lot of muscadine growers that sell their grapes to custom crush operations that we now also have in the state that we didn't have, you know, before. So that's a good development. The industry is relatively young. The people that come back, they want to try something. But one thing which I think is everywhere is that it's a try and error. It's like Fritz says, you know, so a lot of that is like you buy 25 or maybe 100 wines, and if they don't work, you don't be afraid to rip them out and replace them, you know, because they won't work at your location. And there's no way that at least my program or any program can really like go into every single microclimate or mesoclimate that is in the state and try all the cultivars that people want to grow, you know. So there's always like this portion where the grower has to evaluate on their field that we just will not be able to answer, you know. So that is always there. That's why people like Fritz are so important, because they see a lot more of the world and they can actually advise us a little bit more on what's going on outside of our state, you know. So yeah, so that's part of it. And for us in North Carolina here, muscadines have become as a backbone of the industry. It's, I would say, 40 to 50% of the wine produced is muscadine wine in North Carolina. I'm pretty sure it's not sure how it looks in Georgia, but at least that's for us the case. And you know, that's great that it's own rooted and works fairly well, really, you know, in the Southeast. You know.
There's two things we want to do here moving forward. Is one thing is I don't want to leave out, because there's somebody sitting on this going, I'm not planting hybrids and I'm not planting muscadines. I'm a vinifera guy. That's what I want. So I don't want to exclude that community. So top 3 vinifera varieties for the South. Bob's already brought up the point of Petite Mansing, and I know for Georgia, Petite Mansing, Petit Verdot are some good selections. So anybody else want to comment on vinifera varieties that seem to have a better record than the rest?
I would throw Cab Franc in there. That works pretty well here too.
Cab Franc, yeah.
Petit Verdot, Petit Manseng for sure. Yeah.
Anybody else?
I'll repeat, dead in Arkansas, but I can name some. We did some Zen here. We had Zen for a long, long time.
I think we're just seeing some alternatives to Chardonnay that just do better, like a Chardonnay.
The Chardonnay does fantastic in the
Yeah,
South.
Chardonnay is big, yeah.
So as we think about this, there's lots of alternatives, and you know, we can have our own Bordeaux blend of the South, but it's going to be of things that you don't know about. But it's going to taste, we think, pretty good.
I think it's
all right.
really hard to answer because it depends a lot on the location, at least here in North Carolina, you know. So I feel like generally Petit Verdot is doing well. Typically Petit Manseng is doing well, you know. Cab Franc seems to do very fine here in most locations. Chardonnay can be planted and can be cropped, but you really have to be very careful with site selection, and you will get frost damage on a Chardonnay like frequently. But it works, you know. And that's a Merlot works for the most part. You don't get to the quality that you probably will get in an arid climate, but it works, you know. So, and that's what most of our vinifera industry grows, basically, you know. And then we have things like Montepulciano that people try right now, and that seems to work in some locations better. And everything with a Pinot in it is very difficult here.
I think we've looked at Eastern European varieties here a little bit too.
Yeah, we have.
That's very, very region specific though.
Yeah.
But
Mark,
Justin, I heard-
emphasis on the no at the end of that, the Pinot.
Pinot,
Yeah.
yeah. We have some Pinot growers, but it's difficult. It's very difficult. And same with Riesling. We grow Riesling, but it is pretty difficult, especially because of the rot, basically, you know. So
I want to continue to move on. My hardest job is keeping this at an hour, and because I rambled for about 5 minutes in introductions and different things, and we're going to go 5 minutes over. So, but what I want y'all to do is in a few sentences, let the audience know what's going on in your world. If that's the university, what's your university doing? If you're in industry, private consulting, what's relevant, what's the newest. I mean, a part of this is to go over, the spirits disease, we're having a hard time, that's good gravy. But if you had their ear for your elevator speech, what's your university doing that you feel is relevant for that short talk? Justin, go for it.
Okay. Well, so there's quite a number of us that work in viticulturology world in Texas, and this is because of the industry. They saw value in having technical support and applied research, and so we have 11 people now that work across the state, large state, but that also includes a pretty big graduate student program. We have 13, I believe, master's and PhD students, which means that really allows us to expand our research activities. And I was just putting together a presentation. We have a research symposium on Friday, and I believe we have about 25 active research projects right now, primarily in producers' fields or in wineries, and they range from any topic you can imagine, from soil and water to cultivars. But we do a lot of technical support and educational programming because we have a lot of new and prospective producers, and I think that's true probably in the South. There's a lot of interest in grapes and wine. And so, when we can meet with these people and share just what we've learned through our observations, I think it's really helpful because, as you know, it's a pretty significant investment on both sides. And, there's a lot of mistakes that can be avoided. So we try to do as much as we can to address that. There's always more research projects that we would like to do. And the last thing I will comment is I'm looking at everyone on this panel right here. I think we're all working together on at least one project collaboratively. So that's a big part of it too, is reaching out and working across state lines.
Yeah, I'll go next because the project we're working on is ours. We just submitted yesterday successfully. I haven't sent the email out to everyone. $6.5 million grant to do Vitis muscadinia crossing work, hybrid work on white hybrids, and this is disease resistance from muscadine and going into vinifera, and cool quality attributes going into vinifera, and vice versa. I may have said that backwards, but anyway, vice versa. So that's one thing. But I'd say in Arkansas, our breeding program, but also our ability to go from breeding wine grapes, table grapes, juice grapes, muscadine grapes to the food science end, we have that realm of going all the way from beginning to consumer end as well over here in Arkansas. But yeah,
who's so important? Who does such a good job in that food science department that just makes that happen?
I think it's me.
It's okay to toot your own horn.
Justin knows it's hard if you do. I mean, I think Patrick talked about it a little bit. Like, it's hard for wine grape breeding to, because the grower can't go out there and go, this tastes good, it'll make a great wine. I mean, you have to spend decades doing the wine work on it, juice too as well. So.
All right, Eric.
Yeah, Mississippi State, things are looking up. A few years ago, we wouldn't have any possibility of doing any work with enology or anything like that. People have changed, and now there's a lot of interest in that area. We're even looking at potentially putting in a small wine lab at one of our stations in South Mississippi at McNeil. And I have a graduate student, a PhD student, Haley Williams, who's working on wine. We've kind of chosen a variety that most of you have probably never heard of, which is called Mid-South. It was released from Mississippi State University 40 years ago. And it is by far the best grape that we've grown here. We've tried Blanc de Bois, Black Spanish, everything else, and this thing just keeps growing and producing grapes no matter what. Now, is the quality of the grape always great? No. So we're looking at ways to improve that. There she is. So she's also looking at wild yeasts, and in addition to your commercial yeast, and figuring out what kind of benefits that brings to the wine. But we're also doing some variety trials, looking at environmental tolerances of these grapes and muscadines. We just inherited a sizable muscadine vineyard from the ARS on that McNeil station. So we'll hopefully be doing some more trialing of new muscadine varieties there as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Mr. Mark.
Yeah, so our situation is a little bit different than in Texas. We only have me, and I also work on other crops. So it's like basically half a person works in viticulture. I see my job in like moving this industry a little bit forward, and then hoping that we build a little viticulture team. We're hiring a PhD level full-time viticulturist. She already accepted the position. She will start in March the 1st. So we will be 1.5 persons from then on. And I'm looking very forward to her program development. And yeah, then we do replicated cultivar trials. We have muscadine replicated trial where we have some of the Arkansas stuff in there as well. And we do have a Pierce's disease a replicated trial with the UC Davis cultivars and a bunch of other stuff in
And
there.
didn't you also do some work on some Uber vines?
We do Uber wine. That's my kind of thing. Yeah, we're working with improving transplant quality, if you will. So, and we also working with breeding programs to speed up grape breeding, which can take quite a bit of time. So that's in a nutshell what we're doing.
All right. Sarah and Patrick, I'll let y'all share the floor for Georgia.
Oh yeah, well, I can start with my stuff. So I am fairly new to UGA. I started in March of this past year. So I have a new and growing program right now. And some of the focuses that we are currently working on is one, collating some of the information that we've been growing so far so we can get some more just baseline cultivar evaluation information, so we can then take that to a more systematic level going forward. So doing some more tests such as how well does some of the PD varieties work in some different areas, some of the newer stuff, like those Walker vines, versus some of the other varieties such as the Aravel that was mentioned, that white variety. How well does it work in Georgia? And how well does it work if you were in a higher PD risk area? As well as if we can take that forward so we can get more information on some of the rootstock, some of the viticultural practices that we have to do but take a lot of labor, and where can you adjust your labor needs where you have those limitations present. And just some other basic viticultural information, because there's a lot of different routes that we can go for a lot of this information in the Southeast, because there's a lot of information that we need. So Patrick?
Yeah, the Georgia breeding program for muscadine's always been focused on the fresh market. What the growers have asked us for is perfect flowered varieties that have the very large berry size of like a Supreme, which is about 15-gram berry. And our last two releases, Pawk and Ruby Crisp, are right around the 15-gram, and we're getting newer selections that we're getting up to 20 grams when the perfect flowered. One of the issues that's bringing in, though, that I think we're going to need viticulture work to solve is that the perfect flowered varieties are much more fruitful than are the female varieties. And, you could handle that when they were small berries, and it wasn't too bad at 10 or 11 grams, but now that we're getting up to 15 grams and more, we're probably going to need to do something to manage crop load and figure out how to successfully do that in muscadine. So I'm hopeful to work with some viticulturists to maybe, we've been kind of putting muscadines out there and kind of letting them do their own thing, but I think we're going to have to manage some of these new varieties a little more closely than that.
Thank you, Patrick. And Fritz, from a kind of an industry, what you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I see my role more and more as I'm no longer doing variety evaluations and trials with extension anymore. Thank you, Justin and Sarah, for taking over all that data in Georgia and doing something with that. I feel like I'm more of almost like a financial advisor in some ways to these growers who are coming in, because what they're creating is a portfolio, and the diversification is really the key. So how much are they willing to put into a high risk variety? Are they going to do 50% of their portfolio on a fringe vinifera? And I say fringe, I mean even Petit Verdot and Cab Franc took a hit in the December freeze in Georgia, for example. And we've seen this happen in Texas with early fall freezes. So we're getting more and more information from this anecdotal large climate events that happen in regions. And we see, you know, Merlot died, but Petit Verdot kind of lived okay. So we kind of know that. So now it's a matter of, okay, how much of the vineyard do we want to put into the Petit Verdot versus putting in some Chambourcin? And how willing are we to go back and explore some varieties that are known to work, but just don't have the market, you know, Maréchal Foch or Deschanac, you know, are they something we could be growing? If the winery is going to sell all of the wine themselves, then they can grow those varieties and not worry so much about getting a brand recognized grape variety, because they're in a sense creating their own brand. So I think my role is to study what you're all doing and help advise a diversified portfolio, and then it needs to match what the end goal is in production. If the winery is going to be selling on a store shelf somewhere, they need some name recognition, or at least a brand that's come out. So I guess I'm looking more forward towards the end. How are these grapes going to be used in the marketing? Because ultimately, that's going to drive whether the vineyard's successful or not.
Well, panel, this is the first time I've gone 12 minutes over, but I think it was a good way to spend it. It's so much valuable information. I wish we had a whole nother hour. People don't drop off yet, people. Come on, hang on for a second. I want to put a plug in. This is why you need to join ASEV Eastern Section, so you can come to our conference and you can trial all the wines from these different regions and compare and have conversation and talk and meet these fine people. It's a fantastic organization. It's conversations like this to where we can make an impact. We've all said working together is better. And if you're a grower and you're listening in, we encourage you to work with your local universities and consultants on trialing grapes. I think if that's something that we need to do, we've got to be looking and be willing to sacrifice a little bit in the beginning to learn a lot. So, and share that information with your extension agents, specialists, and beyond. So, panelists, I just want to thank y'all so much. This is the last one of the year. It's been a great year on Hangtime, Grapevines to Wines. I do plan to continue on next year. We may take a break in January just to have a break. Probably will pick up in February. So attendees, thank you all so much for coming in and joining us. And I apologize for going over a little bit. I'll stop recording. And let's see.